The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty main street of Cedar Ridge as Sarah McKenna stepped out of Henderson's general store, her worn leather boots crunching on the gravel. The wooden planks of the boardwalk creaked under her weight as she adjusted the heavy sack of flour balanced on her hip. At 32, Sarah had learned to carry herself with the quiet strength that frontier life demanded, her calloused hands and sun-weathered face telling the story of a woman who had survived more than most. "Mrs. McKenna, Sarah." The breathless voice of young Billy Henderson came from behind her. The 13-year-old boy stumbled as he rushed to catch up, his face flushed red from running in the heat. "Ma says you need to hear this right away." Sarah turned, her green eyes narrowing with concern. News in Cedar Ridge traveled fast, and when it came delivered at a run, it was rarely good. "What is it, Billy?" The boy gulped air, wiping sweat from his forehead with his shirt sleeve. "It's about Mr. Brennan, Ma'am, Thomas Brennan. He's dead." The flour sack slipped from Sarah's grip, hitting the boardwalk with a dull thud that sent white powder puffing into the hot air. For a moment, the world seemed to stop spinning. Thomas Brennan, her ex-husband, the man whose cruelty had driven her to seek one of the territory's rare divorces just 18 months ago. "How?" she asked quietly, her voice barely audible above the distant sound of hammering from the blacksmith shop. "Horse threw him yesterday morning up near Devil's Canyon. Broke his neck, they say. Sheriff Morrison found him this morning when he didn't come back to the ranch." Billy's eyes were wide with the importance of being the bearer of such momentous news. "Ma says the whole town's been talking about what'll happen now, you being his widow and all." "Ex-widow," Sarah corrected sharply, then immediately regretted her tone. The boy wasn't to blame for the complicated mess her life had become. "I mean, we were divorced, Billy, legally." But even as she said it, Sarah knew how little that would matter to the good people of Cedar Ridge. In their eyes, she would always be Thomas Brennan's woman, bound to him by ties that went deeper than any courthouse papers. The fact that she had chosen to leave him, to seek divorce rather than endure his drunken rages and wandering hands, only made her more suspect in their judgment. Billy nodded solemnly, though his confusion was obvious. Divorce was still a foreign concept to most folks in the territory. "Sheriff Morrison says the funeral will be day after tomorrow, at the church. Ma wanted me to tell you because she figured you'd want to know." Sarah bent to gather up what flour she could salvage, her mind racing. The funeral. Of course there would be a funeral, and of course the entire town would expect her to attend. They would expect her to play the part of the grieving widow, dressed in black, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, accepting condolences for the loss of a man who had made her life a living hell. "Thank your mother for me, Billy," she said, straightening up with the damaged flour sack. "Tell her I appreciate her thinking of me." As the boy scampered back toward the store, Sarah stood alone on the boardwalk, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes upon her. Through the windows of the barbershop, she could see men's faces turned toward her, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and disapproval. Mrs. Hartwell emerged from the seamstress shop across the street, her thin lips pursed in that particular way that meant gossip was about to spread like wildfire through dry grass. Sarah walked quickly toward her small cabin on the edge of town, her thoughts churning like tumbleweeds in a dust devil. Thomas was dead. After all these years of his bullying and threatening, after all the times she had lain awake at night, wondering if he might come for her in a drunken rage, he was simply gone. She should feel relief. She should feel free. Instead, all she felt was the crushing weight of expectation, settling on her shoulders like a heavy blanket in the desert heat. The town would be watching her every move now, judging whether she showed proper grief, whether she honored his memory the way a wife should, divorce or no divorce. As she reached her small log cabin, set apart from the main cluster of buildings, Sarah paused at her front door. The afternoon shadows were growing long, and she knew that somewhere out in the desert beyond town, another pair of eyes would also be watching for her return. Naalnish would have heard the news by now. News traveled fast along Apache trails, faster sometimes than it moved through white settlements. She wondered what he would think of Thomas Brennan's death. The Apache warrior had never spoken directly about her ex-husband, but she had seen the way his dark eyes hardened whenever Thomas's name came up in conversation. There was history there, history that ran deeper than just the general hatred between their peoples. Sarah pushed open her cabin door and stepped into the blessed coolness of the interior. Tomorrow she would have to make a decision that would shock the entire town. Tomorrow she would have to choose between the expectations of white society and the truth of her own heart. But tonight, for just a few hours, she would allow herself to grieve, not for Thomas Brennan, but for the woman she used to be, before life in the Arizona Territory had taught her that survival sometimes meant making choices that others would never understand. As the sun began its descent behind the jagged peaks of the Dragoon Mountains, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and crimson, Sarah made her way along the narrow path that led to the old cottonwood grove 2 miles east of town. Her footsteps were silent on the sandy ground, a skill she had learned from watching Naalnish move through the wilderness like a shadow given form. The grove had become their meeting place over the past 2 years, ever since the day he had saved her from 3 drunken cowboys who had cornered her on her way back from translating for the army at Fort Huachuca. She had been working as a translator then, one of the few white women who had bothered to learn enough Apache to serve as a bridge between the military and the reservation leaders. It was dangerous work, made more dangerous by men like those cowboys who saw her cooperation with the Apache as a betrayal of her own race. Naalnish had appeared from nowhere that day, moving with the deadly grace of a mountain cat. He had not needed to kill the men. His reputation alone had been enough to send them fleeing back to town with their tails between their legs. But instead of disappearing back into the desert as she had expected, he had stayed to make sure she reached home safely. Now, as she approached the grove, she could see his silhouette against the darkening sky. He sat motionless beneath the largest cottonwood, his back straight, his long black hair moving gently in the evening breeze. Even in stillness, there was something about Naalnish that spoke of coiled energy, of a man always ready to spring into action. "You heard," Sarah said softly, as she settled onto a fallen log across from him. It was not a question. Naalnish nodded, his dark eyes reflecting the last light of the dying day. "The wind carries many voices," he replied in his careful English, the words measured and precise. He had been learning her language just as she had learned his, though his progress was slower, hampered by a lifetime of viewing English as the language of his enemies. "The whole town is talking about the funeral," Sarah continued, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders as the desert began its nightly transformation from furnace to icebox. "They expect me to play the grieving widow. You do not grieve for him." Again, it was not a question. Naalnish had an unsettling ability to see straight through to the heart of things, to cut through the layers of pretense that white society demanded. "No," Sarah admitted. "I should feel something, I suppose. We were married for 3 years, but all I feel is—" She searched for the right words, switching to Apache because some concepts were easier to express in his language. "Like a great weight has been lifted from my shoulders." A ghost of a smile crossed Naalnish's weathered face. "It is good to speak truth under the open sky," he said. "Your people, they fear truth. They wrap it in pretty words and bury it deep." Sarah couldn't argue with that observation. In the 2 years since she had known him, Naalnish had never lied to her, never tried to spare her feelings with false comfort or empty platitudes. It was one of the things she valued most about their friendship, though she knew it was also one of the things that made their relationship so incomprehensible to the people of Cedar Ridge. "There's something else," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want to ask you something, but I don't know if you'll understand why." Naalnish waited, patient as the stones that dotted the desert floor. Patience was another Apache virtue that white society seemed to have forgotten in its rush to tame the frontier. "The funeral is tomorrow afternoon," Sarah began, then stopped, gathering her courage. "I want you to come with me." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a distant fire. Naalnish's expression didn't change, but Sarah saw something flicker in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, or concern. "Your people would not welcome me," he said finally. "No," Sarah agreed. "They wouldn't. They'd be shocked, outraged. Some of them might even try to stop us." "Then why?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, listening to the evening sounds of the desert, the call of a coyote in the distance, the rustle of small creatures in the brush, the whisper of wind through the cottonwood leaves. How could she explain the feeling that had been growing in her chest since she heard the news of Thomas's death? How could she make him understand that she was tired of living her life according to other people's expectations? "Because I'm done pretending," she said at last. "I'm done being who they want me to be instead of who I am. And who I am is a woman whose closest friend is an Apache warrior, whether that fits their idea of proper behavior or not." Naalnish studied her face in the gathering darkness, his gaze intense and searching. "This will bring you trouble," he warned. "Your people, they will not forgive such a thing. They will cast you out." "Maybe," Sarah acknowledged. "But if I don't do this, if I put on that black dress and play the part they expect, I'll be casting myself out. I'll be betraying everything I've learned, everything I've become since I met you." A nighthawk cried overhead, its call sharp and haunting in the still air. Naalnish rose smoothly to his feet, moving with the fluid grace that never failed to amaze Sarah. For a moment she thought he was going to refuse, to disappear back into the desert and leave her to face the funeral alone. Instead, he extended his hand to help her up. "Then we will face their anger together," he said simply. "But I warn you, Sarah McKenna, once this thing is done, there will be no going back. Your place in their world will be changed forever." Sarah took his offered hand, feeling the calloused strength of his fingers as he pulled her to her feet. "Good," she said, and was surprised to realize she meant it. "I'm tired of that world anyway." As they walked back toward town in companionable silence, the first stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky, Sarah felt a strange sense of peace settling over her. Tomorrow would bring chaos, anger, and possibly danger. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, she would face it as herself, not as the woman others expected her to be. Behind them, the cottonwood grove stood sentinel in the desert, keeper of their secrets, and witness to the choice that would change everything. The morning of Thomas Brennan's funeral dawned clear and hot, with not a cloud in the vast Arizona sky to offer mercy from the relentless sun. Sarah stood before the cracked mirror in her bedroom, staring at her reflection as she braided her auburn hair into a simple knot at the base of her neck. She had chosen to wear her best dress, a deep blue cotton that brought out her eyes, rather than the black mourning attire that convention demanded. Let them talk, she thought, securing the braid with her mother's silver hairpins. They'll have plenty more to discuss before this day is through. By 10 o'clock, the main street of Cedar Ridge was already bustling with unusual activity. People had come from ranches and settlements for miles around to pay their respects to Thomas Brennan, who had been one of the territory's more prosperous cattle ranchers despite his personal failings. Sarah watched from her window as wagons rolled into town, kicking up clouds of dust that hung in the still air like a brown fog. She recognized most of the faces: the Hartwell family from their spread north of town, old Pete Morrison, who ran cattle in the foothills, the Williams clan with their 6 tow-headed children. These were people who had known Thomas, who had done business with him, who had overlooked his drinking and his temper because he paid his debts and kept his word in matters of commerce. A knock at her door interrupted her observations. Sarah opened it to find Mrs. Henderson, Billy's mother, standing on her small porch with a black dress draped over her arm. "I thought you might need this," the older woman said, her voice carefully neutral. Mrs. Henderson had always been kind to Sarah, even after the divorce, but there was something strained in her manner today. "It was my sister's, God rest her soul. I thought it might fit you." Sarah looked at the dress, a severe black garment with long sleeves and a high collar that would have covered her from chin to toe. "That's very thoughtful of you, Mrs. Henderson, but I won't be needing it." The woman's eyebrows rose. "Sarah, dear, you can't mean to attend the funeral in—" She gestured vaguely at Sarah's blue dress. "In that. What will people think?" "I imagine they'll think exactly what they want to think, regardless of what I wear," Sarah replied gently. "But I thank you for the kindness." Mrs. Henderson's face tightened with disapproval, but she simply nodded and turned away, clutching the black dress to her chest like a shield against impropriety. As the noon hour approached, Sarah made her way to the edge of town, where she had arranged to meet Naalnish. She found him waiting in the shade of a large boulder, dressed in his finest clothing, a shirt of soft buckskin decorated with intricate beadwork, leather leggings, and moccasins that made no sound on the rocky ground. His long hair was braided with strips of red cloth, and a single eagle feather hung from a leather cord around his neck. "You look like a warrior going to council," Sarah observed, and was relieved to see him smile. "And you look like a woman who has made her choice," he replied, studying her blue dress with approval. "It is a good color for you, the color of deep water and open sky." Together, they walked toward the small white church that sat at the heart of Cedar Ridge. As they approached, Sarah could see the crowd gathering outside, men in their best suits despite the heat, women in dark dresses fanning themselves with folded papers, children running between the adults until sharp words called them back to order. The first person to notice their approach was Sheriff Morrison, a grizzled man in his 50s who had been keeping the peace in Cedar Ridge for more than a decade. His weather-beaten face went slack with shock as he took in the sight of Sarah walking arm in arm with the Apache warrior. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," he muttered, loud enough for half the crowd to hear. "What in the hell does she think she's doing?" The murmur of conversation died away, as if someone had dropped a heavy blanket over the gathering. Faces turned toward them, expressions ranging from confusion to outrage to barely contained fury. Sarah felt Naalnish tense beside her, his warrior's instincts alert to the hostility radiating from the crowd. "Easy," she whispered to him in Apache. "They bark like coyotes, but most of them have never learned to bite." Dr. William Hayes, the town's physician and one of its leading citizens, stepped forward from the crowd. His face was flushed red with anger and indignation. "Mrs. McKenna," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the still air, "surely you cannot mean to bring this person, child, into a Christian house of worship." "This person," Sarah replied calmly, "has a name. His name is Naalnish, and he is my friend. I would appreciate it if you would address him with the respect due to any human being." A woman's voice called out from the crowd, "It's a disgrace. Thomas Brennan was a white man, and this is supposed to be a Christian funeral. Ought to be ashamed of yourself, Sarah McKenna," another voice added, "consorting with savages and then bringing one to your own husband's burial." "Ex-husband," Sarah corrected firmly, her voice carrying over the growing murmur of angry voices. "And I'm not ashamed of anything I've done today." Pastor Williams, a thin, nervous man who had only been in Cedar Ridge for 2 years, appeared in the church doorway. His face was pale, and his hands shook slightly as he adjusted his spectacles. "Mrs. McKenna," he said, his voice barely audible above the crowd's grumbling, "perhaps it would be best if, that is to say, maybe your friend could wait outside while—" "No," Sarah said simply. "We'll attend the service together, or we won't attend at all." The crowd's murmur grew louder, more hostile. Someone shouted something about Indian lovers and race traitors. Sarah felt Naalnish's muscles coil with tension, and she knew that his patience with white men's insults had limits. Just as the situation seemed about to explode into violence, an unexpected voice cut through the chaos. "Let them pass." The crowd turned to see who had spoken, and Sarah was surprised to see old Jake Morrison, the sheriff's father and one of the territory's first settlers. The ancient man leaned heavily on a walking stick, his white beard reaching nearly to his belt, but his eyes were still sharp and commanding. "I said let them pass," Jake repeated, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had survived 40 years on the frontier. "This is America, and folks have a right to attend a funeral if they've a mind to. Thomas Brennan's dead and buried won't be any less dead because an Apache warrior comes to see him off." The crowd shifted uncertainly, caught between their prejudices and their respect for the old patriarch. Sheriff Morrison looked torn between his duty to keep the peace and his own obvious discomfort with the situation. "Besides," Jake continued, a sly grin creasing his weathered face, "I'm curious to see what happens next. Ain't had this much excitement in Cedar Ridge since the Apaches ran off Johnson's cattle in '79. Slowly, reluctantly, the crowd parted to create a narrow path toward the church door. Sarah and Naalnish walked through the gauntlet of hostile stairs, their heads held high, neither hurrying nor hesitating. At the church steps, Sarah paused and turned back to face the crowd. "Thomas Brennan was my husband once," she said, her voice clear and strong. "He was also a complicated man with secrets that some of you might be surprised to learn. Today, I hope we can honor not just his memory, but the truth of who he really was." With that, she and Naalnish climbed the steps and disappeared into the cool darkness of the church, leaving behind a crowd buzzing with speculation, anger, and unwilling curiosity about what revelations the day might bring. The interior of Cedar Ridge's small church felt like a tomb compared to the blazing heat outside. Dust motes danced in the colored light that filtered through the single stained glass window behind the altar, and the air hung heavy with the scent of pine wood and old hymn books. At the front of the sanctuary, Thomas Brennan's coffin sat on a simple wooden stand, surrounded by wildflowers that someone had gathered from the desert. Sarah and Naalnish paused just inside the doorway, letting their eyes adjust to the dim light. The church could hold perhaps 60 people when packed, and it was filling rapidly as the crowd from outside reluctantly followed them in. Sarah could feel the weight of their stares, hear the rustle of fabric and whispered conversations that stopped abruptly whenever she turned her head. Pastor Williams gestured nervously toward the front pew, traditionally reserved for the immediate family of the deceased. "Mrs. McKenna, if you would, that is your usual place." Sarah nodded and walked down the center aisle, Naalnish beside her, their footsteps echoing on the worn wooden floor. She was acutely aware of every eye following their progress, of the sharp intake of breath from Mrs. Hartwell as they passed her row, of the way children's whispers were quickly shushed by their parents. As they settled into the front pew, Sarah caught a glimpse of the crowd behind them. The church was indeed packed, with latecomers standing along the walls. She recognized most of the faces, shopkeepers and ranchers, their wives and children, even some of the rougher men who usually spent their Sundays sleeping off Saturday nights drinking rather than attending church services. Pastor Williams took his place at the simple wooden pulpit, his hands visibly trembling as he opened his worn Bible. The man was clearly out of his depth. He had arrived in Cedar Ridge from back east and had never dealt with anything more controversial than disputes over church supper menus. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice cracking slightly, "we are gathered here today to pay our final respects to Thomas James Brennan, who departed this life on Tuesday morning in his 42nd year." The pastor launched into a generic funeral sermon, speaking of Thomas's contributions to the community, his success as a rancher, his place among the pioneers who had helped build the territory. Sarah listened with half an ear, her attention focused more on the restless energy she could feel building in the crowd behind her. Beside her, Naalnish sat perfectly still, his dark eyes fixed on the coffin at the front of the church. She wondered what he was thinking, what memories this funeral might be stirring. She knew that Apache funeral customs were very different from white Christian traditions, involving complex rituals designed to help the dead find their way to the spirit world while protecting the living from ghostly interference. Thomas Brennan was a man of the frontier, Pastor Williams continued, warming to his theme. He carved a life out of this harsh land through hard work and determination. He built his ranch with his own hands, established trade relationships that benefited the entire community, and Pastor Williams, the voice cut through the sermon like a knife through canvas. Sarah turned, startled, to see that Naalnish had risen to his feet. The entire congregation seemed to hold its breath. The pastor's mouth fell open. Excuse me? I would speak of Thomas Brennan, Naalnish said, his English careful but clear. If it is permitted in your house of worship, for one who knew him to speak truth. A murmur ran through the congregation like wind through wheat. Sarah could hear the sharp whispers. "The nerve! Outrageous! Someone stop this!" Pastor Williams looked desperately around the church, as if hoping someone would tell him what to do. His gaze fell on Sheriff Morrison, who simply shrugged, then on old Jake Morrison, who was leaning forward with obvious interest. "This is highly irregular," the pastor stammered. "I'm not sure that is to say our customs don't usually—" Let him speak. The voice belonged to Maria Santos, Thomas Brennan's Mexican housekeeper, who sat 3 rows back. She was a small, weathered woman who had worked for Thomas for nearly 10 years. "If he has something to say about Signor Thomas, let him say it." Other voices joined in, some protesting, others curious. Sheriff Morrison finally stood up. "Pastor, seems to me that if a man has something to say about the deceased, Christian charity suggests we ought to listen, long as he keeps it respectful." Pastor Williams nodded weakly and stepped aside. Naalnish moved to the front of the church with his characteristic fluid grace, turning to face the congregation. Sarah could see the hostility radiating from many of the faces, arms crossed, jaws set, eyes hard with prejudice and anger. "My people do not speak the names of the dead," Naalnish began, his voice carrying clearly in the hushed church. "We believe it calls their spirits back from the journey they must make. But your ways are different, and this man's story should be told." He paused, his gaze moving slowly across the congregation. Sarah saw several people shift uncomfortably under his direct stare. 3 winters ago," Naalnish continued, "when the snows came early and deep, many of my people were hungry. The government supplies, they did not come. The children, they grew thin and weak." Sarah felt her heart begin to race. She had no idea where this was leading, but she could sense that something significant was about to be revealed. "Your law says we cannot hunt beyond the reservation boundaries. Your soldiers, they watch to make sure we stay where you have put us. But children cannot eat laws, and winter does not care about the lines white men draw on paper." The congregation was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Even the children had stopped fidgeting. "Some of our young men, they talked of raiding, of taking cattle to feed their families. It would have meant war. Many would have died, Apache and white alike." Naalnish's voice remained steady, but Sarah could hear the emotion beneath it. "But one white man, he came to our camp in secret, in the dark of night, when no one would see." A collective intake of breath swept through the church. Sarah felt her own breath catch in her throat. "Thomas Brennan brought beef," Naalnish said simply. "Every week through that terrible winter, he brought meat for the children. He told no one, He asked for nothing in return. He said only that children should not starve while men argue about boundaries. The silence in the church was so complete that Sarah could hear the wind whistling through the eaves outside. She stared at Naalnish in amazement, then turned to look at the coffin that held her ex-husband's body. Thomas, the man who had publicly expressed nothing but contempt for redskins and savages, had secretly risked his reputation and possibly his life to feed Apache children. "He made me promise never to speak of this while he lived," Naalnish continued. "He said it would ruin him with his own people, but now he is dead, and I think it is time for truth." The Apache warrior's eyes found Sarah's face in the front pew. "You're Thomas Brennan. He was not a perfect man, but he was not the man most of you believed him to be. And children who are alive today, they are alive because he chose to see them as children first, Apache second." Naalnish returned to his seat beside Sarah, leaving the congregation in stunned silence. Pastor Williams stood frozen at the pulpit, clearly unsure how to continue after such a revelation. Finally, old Jake Morrison's voice broke the quiet. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, apparently forgetting he was in church. "Thomas Brennan, you sly old dog." The spell broken, a dozen conversations erupted at once. Sarah sat in the middle of it all, staring at the coffin and trying to reconcile this new image of Thomas with the man she had divorced. Had there always been this hidden compassion beneath his rough exterior? Had she been too hurt by his treatment of her to see the complexity of his character? As the funeral service continued around her, Sarah found herself grieving for the first time, not for the Thomas Brennan she had known, but for the man he might have been if fear and social pressure hadn't forced him to hide his better nature behind a mask of prejudice and cruelty. The cemetery outside Cedar Ridge sat on a small hill overlooking the town, where desert winds had carved the red earth into gentle slopes, dotted with ocotillo and prickly pear cactus. The afternoon sun blazed overhead as the funeral procession made its way up the dusty path, Thomas Brennan's coffin carried by 6 of his ranch hands who had worked for him for years. Sarah walked directly behind the coffin with Naalnish beside her, no longer caring about the whispered conversations that followed in their wake. The revelation in the church had changed something fundamental in the atmosphere. The hostility was still there, but it was now mixed with confusion, curiosity, and for some, a grudging respect for the man they thought they had known. As they reached the graveside, Pastor Williams positioned himself at the head of the rectangular hole that had been dug in the hard earth. The coffin was lowered carefully on ropes, and the pastor began the traditional committal service. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust, but Sarah found her attention drawn not to the pastor's words, but to the faces around the grave. Maria Santos, Thomas's housekeeper, stood with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. She had known about the food deliveries, Sarah realized. She had probably helped prepare the beef that Thomas carried to the Apache children. Dr. Hayes, who had been so outraged at the church, now stood with his hat in his hands, his expression thoughtful rather than angry. Sheriff Morrison kept glancing between Naalnish and the grave, as if trying to puzzle out some complex equation. When the service ended and people began to drift away, Sarah was surprised to find several mourners approaching, rather than avoiding her. Maria Santos was the first, embracing Sarah with genuine warmth. "I am glad you brought him," Maria whispered, nodding toward Naalnish. "Senor Thomas, he would have been pleased that someone finally told the truth about those winters." Dr. Hayes approached next, his earlier hostility replaced by awkward embarrassment. "Mrs. McKenna," he said, extending his hand to Naalnish, "I owe you an apology, and thank you for what you shared today. It changes how I'll remember Thomas." One by one, others came forward. Not everyone. Some still departed with angry backward glances, but enough to make Sarah realize that Naalnish's words had planted seeds that might eventually grow into something resembling understanding. Old Jake Morrison was among the last to approach. He studied Naalnish with sharp eyes before speaking. That took courage, speaking truth in front of a hostile crowd. "Your people, they're lucky to have a warrior with such wisdom." Naalnish inclined his head respectfully. "And your people are learning that wisdom can come from unexpected places." As the crowd thinned, Sarah found herself alone at the graveside with Naalnish and Maria Santos. The housekeeper pulled a small wrapped bundle from her shawl. "Senor Thomas, he asked me to give this to you if anything happened to him," she said to Sarah. "I thought perhaps today is the right time." Sarah unwrapped the bundle to find a leather journal, its pages yellow with age. She opened it carefully and found Thomas's handwriting filling the first page. "Sarah, if you're reading this, then I'm dead, and maybe you're wondering why I was such a bastard to you when you tried to show me a better way to live. The truth is, I was scared. Scared of what people would think. Scared of losing everything I'd built. Scared of being seen as weak. But you were right about the Apache. They're people, just like us, trying to take care of their families and live with dignity. I hope someday this territory will be big enough for all of us to do that. Sarah's vision blurred with tears as she read her ex-husband's words. Below the opening entry, she found pages documenting every delivery of food to the Apache camp, every interaction with the children who had benefited from his secret generosity. He was a different man when he went to the reservation, Maria said softly, gentle with the children, respectful to the elders. I think he wished he could be that man all the time, but he didn't know how. As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, Sarah and Naalnish walked slowly back toward town. The streets were quieter than usual, as if the events of the day had left everyone with much to think about. What happens now? Sarah asked as they paused at the edge of the main street. Naalnish considered the question carefully. Change comes slowly, he said finally, like water wearing away stone. But today, the water began to flow. They were interrupted by the sound of running feet. Billy Henderson appeared, breathless and excited. Mrs. McKenna, Ma wants to know if you and your friend would like to come for supper tomorrow night. She says she has questions about the Apache children, and maybe there are ways the town could help instead of always fighting. Sarah looked at Naalnish, who nodded slightly. Tell your mother we'd be honored to accept her invitation, Billy. The boy grinned and ran off, eager to carry the news back to his family. As Sarah watched him go, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, hope for the future. You were right, she said to Naalnish. There's no going back from this, but maybe that's not such a terrible thing. The Apache warrior smiled, and for the first time since she had known him, Sarah saw something that might have been optimism in his dark eyes. Perhaps Thomas Brennan's greatest gift was not the food he brought to hungry children, he said. Perhaps it was showing us that people can be more than they appear to be if we have the courage to let them. As the evening star appeared in the darkening sky, Sarah and Naalnish stood together at the crossroads of their two worlds, no longer as representatives of opposing cultures, but as friends who had helped plant the seeds of a different kind of future. Thomas Brennan was buried, but the truth about his hidden kindness lived on. Proof that even in the harsh landscape of the Arizona Territory, understanding could bloom in the most unlikely places. The next morning would bring new challenges, new prejudices to face, and new bridges to build. But tonight, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Sarah McKenna slept peacefully, knowing that she had chosen truth over convenience, friendship over fear, and hope over hatred. In the desert outside town, a coyote called to the moon, and its cry sounded almost like a song of celebration for the small victory that had been won this day, not through violence or conquest, but through the simple power of one man's courage to speak truth in a place where truth was desperately needed.